check your notes. Is there anything that you're not sure about? On the reservation, discussing reservations, we talked about sessions. We talked about the different strange kind of title that there is. How reservations were somewhat of a an experiment, sort of a social experiment, you know. It's important to know that. How would you describe to somebody the management of the reservations over time? The administration, I guess, administration of the reservation. They were established by the federal government, and most of the people who were working in the Indian office, as they call it, the Indian agents, so forth, were typically, in the early days, military people. And it was like, you know, maybe Alex, who's a veteran, would, you know, can appreciate this. It's like the job that nobody really wants, you know. And so like all the ne'er-do-wells in the military and in the army wind up going to work in the as Indian agents or in the Indian agencies out in the West, because that's like, you know, they can't screw that up. So, you know, that's where the real losers go. All right, and so that's the you know, that's the dregs, the awful job that nobody wants. So anyway, that's how, you know, that worked. And so then the military decides we're just going to get out of this totally. All right, and of course it was Ulysses Grant, the general, who got the government, who got the army out of the Indian business. And how did he do that?
Said what the missionaries and
yeah, handed it over to the do-gooders, you know, the charitable professional do-gooders, and those are mostly missionary religious organizations, mostly out of New England, some out of Pennsylvania, but mostly out of New England. And so that's where that's how this changes over. It goes from a you know, sort of the marginal job that the military doesn't want to do to something that, oh, some really, really enthusiastic people want to do, okay? We'd love to go change their culture and make them Christians and make them into farmers and help them, okay? Always beware of that sort of people. They were wanting to be in on this new social experiment. All right. Reservations were created, and they would continue to be created, but things changed in American politics toward Indian policy. You know, in 1871, the Congress decided there were going to be no more treaties. Well, if there are no more treaties, can you still have Indian reservations? Yeah, you can. So just because they decide they're not going to have treaties doesn't mean that they don't have the ability to establish reservations. After 1871, reservations would continue to be established through agreements, what are just referred to as agreements, formal agreements between the United States and the tribes, or until 1919, reservations got started through executive order. So there are these reservations, Indian reservations, that are called executive order reservations. They're kind of tenuous because, like any other executive order, you know, something the president decides can be overturned when a new administration comes in. Okay, so they can clear them out. So that it gives a different status to the reservation. And I talked a little bit about, maybe I didn't. Did we talk about the Code of Indian Offenses, or the Courts of Indian Offenses? Okay, the Code of Indian Offenses was a set of rules that were enacted by the administration, enacted by the Office of Indian Affairs. This is the this is an example of Indian policy through administrative rule. It's the worst kind. It's the darkest kind, because there's not a lot of democratic process that goes on. There's not judicial review even. So, even when Congress passes a crappy law, a lot of times the Supreme Court, will say, oh no, this is never going to work, or this is unconstitutional. And so, it gets hammered out. The law hopefully is constitutional when it's passed. But when there's an administrative rule, there's no oversight. So the Office of Indian Affairs would develop programs, they just, bureaucrats somewhere would come up with the idea, that we're going to do this. And a lot of this, this code or Code of Indian Offenses, okay, is basically a laundry list of crimes and punishments that would be leveled against Indians, mostly in boarding schools. Mostly in Indian boarding schools. So, this is like the type of punishment that somebody would get when they do this, okay? And this is like a laundry list that was handed down through the Indian office, not Congress, not the executive, not a court case, just an administrative rule, right? And those are the kinds of Indian policy issues that often wind up getting challenged in the courts later on in the 20th century. They're awful. Okay?
When was this?
The Court of Indian Offenses is operating, it gets started during the reservation era, and then it would continue on into the allotment and assimilation era, or whatever. Your reading refers to the reservation attempted assimilation period. That's all attempted assimilation. I like to refer more to the allotment period and assimilation, because after 1887 is when you have a lot of these boarding schools operating, and a lot of, so anyway, the Court of Indian Offenses and the Code of Indian Offenses is mostly established for those boarding schools. So if there's say a rape or something like that, then this prescribes the punishment for that offender. It has nothing to do with U.S. law. And the reason it's the Indians are sort of extraterritorial to United States law. They certainly can't be tried by the states. So this is before the FBI and before a federal law enforcement agency. So it's basically the Indian Office creating these rules. Right? It's awful, absolutely awful, because there's number one, the people who are being impacted by this don't have any right to vote. They're not even citizens. Okay. Anyway. Well, we'll get into all that stuff later. In terms of the boarding schools, you all probably know that moving children out of their home to a boarding school where they live and maybe don't see their parents for weeks or months at a time. That was one way that these social engineers coming from New England, from they're well-meaning people, professional do-gooders, right? Morally, upstanding folks, I reckon. But they had ideas, and they realized that, if they want to really get serious with changing the culture of these native peoples, they even had sayings like, kill the Indians, save the man. Heard of that one probably. Or we want to get, want to get rid of the Indian tribalism and preserve the people, acculturate them. Oh boy, there were a lot of people that were excited to do that. And they realized that if they could get them away from their parents and their grandparents and their uncles and aunts, then that would be the easiest way. Get the children away from, the culture, then we can shape them the way that you know, we want to. So you can imagine the people drawn to Indian boarding schools and, you know, this whole thing who were, you know, they're thinking about children, okay? Creepy. So anyway, this is, they realized that if they move them away from their families, then they can, you know, acculturate them, assimilate them a lot quicker, which was true. So, of course, a lot of parents, a lot of American Indian parents and grandparents, extended families, you know, they realized that too. They didn't want to give up their kids necessarily. You know, they did want their kids generally to have an education if that was available. But they knew that, you know, this was probably not going to be difficult, or not going to be easy on the kids. So why do you suppose there were so many American Indian kids that wound up in boarding schools? Well, because there weren't other schools. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just about to say that. Because a lot of like
They're the only ones available.
Yeah. And like since I guess conditions on the reservations were so bad that parents didn't want their children to like experience that, so they thought, oh, boarding school, just send them there. They'll have like education.
They'll get an education.
Be able to have like the
They'll be able to
necessities that they need.
adjust.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And a lot of times the schools were mandated by treaty, since the treaty would supply education and healthcare from the government.
Right. So the school was established. But oftentimes there were other schools that were off the reservation that maybe they wanted to, you know, send them to. The reason I like to refer to the allotment period as more of an assimilation period is because by the time of allotment, the Indian boarding school systems have pretty much been established. But allotment had a lot to do with it. Allotment broke up Indian populations who were, you know, living in, you know, more communal settings on reservations. But once they got dispersed, then you really have some serious impoverishment of families. And a lot of those impoverished families on allotments realized that if they sent their kids to, you know, boarding school, well, number one, they're going to get their education, but they're also going to be able to, you know, they're going to be fed, they're going to be clothed, they're going to get some health care when they need it. You know, you can probably come up with a lot of other examples. It was not necessarily something that every parent wanted to do, but oftentimes they did it for the good of their kids, for the future of their children. And I can give you some actual personal examples of kids being sent to boarding school because, you know, like a single mother had a whole bunch of kids and couldn't afford to feed them all, right? And so when the, you know, opportunity to have them sent to a boarding school was there, that was a good trade-off, you know.
Isn't that Jim Thorpe's story? Like his dad was like an alcoholic.
I'm thinking of my wife's grandmother. Yeah, my wife's grandmother was 9 years old. She only spoke Cherokee, but her mother, you know, had other kids, and she didn't have a lot of money, and the Indian agents said, you know, we can put her in boarding school at Sequoia in Tahlequah, which was, you know, far away for her, you know, relatively speaking. And so anyway, she put her in Sequoia, I think they call it Sequoia Indian Training School, and so she could learn English, okay? And she got out when she was 13, so she had a 4-year sentence, and she came out speaking English, and you know, she had all kinds of stories about how they would wash their mouth out with soap and whip them if they were caught speaking Cherokee. And this was in the 1920s. Okay, this is the early 1920s. or mid-1920s. Anyway, so that's still going on. And the person who would end all those schools, John Collier. Now, I talk about John Collier a lot, and in some ways he was a hero, and in some ways he was kind of an anti-hero, for me at least. But let me tell you a little bit about that. So that's what we'll work with the Indian Reorganization Act today. I've told you a little bit about Collier and how he had a sociology background. He was actually came from a fairly well-to-do background in Atlanta and was educated at Columbia University, and then he went to France for a while. So he was in with the avant-garde folks, but he was primarily affected by his year spent in New Mexico among the Taos Pueblo, and had, he became before he was ever a member of the government, of the New Deal group, he was very much a critic of American Indian policy. He was one who was very vocal about the problems on reservations and the problems with allotment. So he was a big critic of allotment. And he was, in fact, had something to do with the development of what became known as the Merriam Report. I think it has two articles. The Merriam Report of 1928. Anybody ever heard of the Merriam Report? Okay. It was done by the Brookings Institution, which still exists today. Brookings Institution is a left-leaning institution, a think tank. And they were very critical of the allotment policy. The Merriam Report called for a number of reforms. By the way, one of the field workers for the Merriam Report happened to be a historian down at the University of Oklahoma, who became pretty well known. Anyway, what the Brookings Institution did was it got a bunch of academics, mostly anthropologists, sociologists, historians, who were familiar with Indian history, and sent them off to various places to collect data. And then they brought all this together and compounded this very thick book called the Merriam Report, or it's actually called The Problem of Indian Administration, referred to as the Merriam Report. And in that report, it was, it was remarked that the Homestead Act, the allotment thing, was not the solution to ending American Indian poverty and other social problems in rural areas. Another thing about this is that most of these people who were highly critical of Indian policy to this point were mostly urbanites who were not attuned to farming or to land ownership necessarily, and so they were critical of this whole idea that we're going to make farmers out of these Indian people, make them into rural Americans. So that essentially they made some noise, and Congress eventually started to shift a little bit on Indian policy. Tell you how far-sighted Collier was. He had the idea early on that the Bureau of Indian Affairs should be abolished, okay? That should turn everything over to the Indians. And this is what he's writing about prior to the New Deal. He was actually, pretty revolutionary in saying that one of the biggest problems for American Indian tribes is the United States government doing everything for them, basically in every facet of their life. And the federal government is not efficient. The Bureau of Indian Affairs is interfering with tribal culture, etc. Okay? Well, I like that about Collier. He was. It's a lot like old Scott Pruitt. Remember Scott Pruitt, our Attorney General, State Attorney General, who was the biggest thorn in the side of the Environmental Protection Agency for years and years, and Trump makes him head of the Environmental Protection Agency. So, but he didn't last very long, I guess. That's kind of what Franklin Roosevelt did, or Ickes did with the BIA. It said, okay, well, this is obviously a government agency that's not cutting it, and let's take the biggest critic it has and put him in charge. Okay, so that's what they did, and so Collier winds up becoming head of the BIA, commissioner of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and he was well known at the Bureau of Indian Affairs as someone who was completely critical of him. So in 1933, we have Collier coming in, John Collier. Commissioner of Indian Affairs, biggest critic it's ever had. And this is what he did. Number one, he said, whoa, we're going to end allotment. Allotment ends today. When I walk into the office, the allotment process is done. Number two, he stopped the removal of restrictions on allotments if those restrictions still existed. Okay, now, back up here. Wait a minute, what are we talking about? Removal of restrictions? Whenever I say restrictions, I'm referring to the restriction on the possibility of alienation of an allotment. So a restricted allotment is an allotment that somebody has received, but yet it's still in that 25-year probationary period where they don't have the allottee does not actually have title yet. Now you might say, well, what if they allotted it in 1900 or 1887? 25 years was a long time ago, right? This is 1934. So let's say 1933. Okay. So 1933 allotments made in 1887. Wouldn't they have already passed into individual hands? Yeah, some of them. And in fact, did I even refer to, have I talked about the Burke Act? I don't think I have. Sorry, I don't think I have yet. In 1906, remember when the 5 tribes were allotted? In 1898's Curtis Act, and then 1899, 1901, 1902, they have agreements, so they start allotting really close to, just a few years before Oklahoma statehood. And the allotments are, very long process, tens of thousands of people getting allotments. And so the allotments, are sort of in process. But then in 1906, we got this very important federal statute passed called the Burke Act. And what this did was it allowed individuals to get fee patents, basically to get waivers on that restriction. Okay? The Burke Act's really important, and you'll see it on the quizzes. The Burke Act was intended to help. Okay, remember we were talking about last time we were talking about having your allotment of 160 acres that you couldn't sell? Remember that? What if you are not someone who is an infantile person when it comes to managing your fiscal affairs? In other words, you're able to handle your own fiscal affairs, right? And you can still be a Native American and do that, okay? At least not, but not in the government's eyes. In the government's eyes, if you're an American Indian, and especially if you weren't even a citizen yet, in the eyes of the federal government, then the federal government had to have some kind of way of knowing that you were competent, okay? That you were competent. And what the Burke Act did, because there were so many people, especially in Indian Territory, so many people said, okay, so, here I am, a quarter Cherokee, and I've got my allotment, and I need to get a mortgage. I need to get some capital so that I can develop this place. And it's crazy that the government won't let me sell it, okay? So people are going to the Indian agents and Indian office and saying, please let me have the title to this land now so that I can utilize it. I mean, it only makes sense, right? So the Burke Act was intended to relieve that. It was intended to give relief to those people who really wanted to utilize their land but couldn't because they didn't have the title to it and they weren't supposed to have it for like 20 years. So the Burke Act was a way to relieve that. Now what it did was it gave Indian administrators, people in the BIA, it gave them the power, the authority to determine whether or not an allottee was competent. All right? Now, when you get to be middle-aged, I hope this doesn't happen to you, but when you get to be middle-aged, it may be the case that you're dealing with a relative who is losing their competence, okay? And it is not fun. It is terrible. It's awful. But who determines that? Well, not a lawyer, not supposed to. Physician, maybe, okay? But that's not what we're dealing with. We're not talking about old folks. We're talking about people who are, maybe not speaking English, or maybe not having an education where they can, an education that allows them to be literate or something. So the question is, what makes somebody competent? Well, the Burke Act gave the authority of, bureaucrats to determine whether or not someone was competent. Before this should probably have been done by a judge or something, right? But this was intended to facilitate that problem of these restrictions. So the faster, more efficient we can get people to have a waiver on the restriction, then the faster we can help them. So the Burke Act was intended to facilitate this. Problem is, now that you've got bureaucrats with more power, they've got authority to determine if somebody's competent. And they're not paid that well. So this was it became a magnet for corruption. So it became an easy way for somebody to take a payoff in order to determine and say, okay, well, they're competent when they maybe weren't. Now that happened, and you can read Angie DeBow all day long to see examples of that, but that's not really my intention. Just keep in mind the Burke Act was intended to facilitate those people who were clearly competent to get that burden off of them where they weren't able to sell their land. But again, it wound up being an example of a way for lawyers to get involved and actually use this law to undercut the intended protections for those people who are truly incompetent. All right, so that's one of the things you'll run into. You'll read about the Burke Act. So what happened is a lot of people sold land after 1906. They were able to get that restriction removed. Okay, so basically what Collier did when he comes in is he said, okay, we're stopping that process. If the land has not been, if there has not been a patent granted to that land, right, then we're not going to give any more waivers or restrictions. That's done. So in that sense, I don't like Collier. All right? Collier says that, you know, we're going to stop this whole removal of restriction stuff. The Indians are going to keep their land, whether they want it or not. Now, a lot of people criticized him for that. But Collier was no weakling when it came to criticism. One thing you got to credit him for, he was a pretty tough cookie. So in 1933, the Indian office stopped removing restrictions from allottees. And so the reasoning, chief reasoning here, and it may be a good reasoning, is that protected those allottees who had done it, you know, had the restrictions removed. It protected them from having the state seize their land for, you know, for delinquent taxes, which is a problem. So anyway, those restrictions would stay on if they hadn't been removed in 1933, and they would stay on until, and this policy would stay on until 1948. Okay, throughout the rest of the what we call this this period of Indian tribal sort of revival during the New Deal, during this new Indian New Deal era. And of course, in 1948, we get this termination, 180-degree turnaround after World War II. After 1948, restrictions could be removed again. Allottees could again apply to have the restrictions removed. So there's a strange period here. All right, number 3. New reservations. Collier so there's no reason why the government shouldn't be recognizing Indian country where it maybe ought to exist. So, and I'm referring to you know, these are changes that Collier brought in largely in the IRA. Okay. Indian Removal Act. Excuse me, Removal Act. Sorry. Cut. What is it called? Reorganization. Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. Okay. So the Indian Reorganization Act is sometimes referred to as this Indian New Deal. 1934. And guess what Indians are not included in the Indian Reorganization Act?
Non-federally recognized.
True. But how about which federally recognized tribes were not included in the Indian Reorganization? All Indians in Oklahoma, in fact. All in Oklahoma. So Oklahoma Indians were excluded from the IRA. What happened there was in 1936, the lawyers realized that that Oklahoma Indians were not going to fall into the same category as everybody else. So in 1936, they passed another law that was just like this, but geared toward affecting Oklahoma Indians, called the Oklahoma Indian Welfare Act, OIWA. Oklahoma Indian Welfare Act 1936 was tuning the Indian Reorganization Act for Oklahoma Indians because of land title differences. And there are other reasons that I'm not familiar with. So Collier is one who's saying, okay, we're stopping allotment, that ends. We're going to stop the removal of restrictions, so Indian allottees are going to keep their allotments. Probably saying, he's probably reasoning that if they haven't already had the restrictions removed, they probably didn't want them removed. So there wouldn't be any more of that. And he says, let's add some land to the reservations. Some reservations have lost so much land through allotment and through losing Indian title in the allotments that they've been, eroded. So let's get the United States government to add a little bit more land to those reservations that are still around. We did that. Another thing that they did that was good, I'd say, is because of the weird legal geography of Indian country, it was often the case that natural resources in Indian country were getting stolen by non-Indians. That had been going on for decades, if not centuries. So another one of the things is that in 1934, the BIA created regulations that restricted logging and grazing in Indian country. So basically stripping those people who were exploiting Indian lands illegally, as if they were, just any other federal land. Basically, they threw off those ranchers and timber cutters from the Indian lands. This is something that the federal government did a long time ago on the forest reserves. All right, forest reserves were created after 1891, and then what happened was, just by creating the forest reserves, didn't do anything because there's no administration. There was no forestry. There was no U.S. Forest Service yet. So they created the Forest Service, and then that's when the national forest basically got protected because everybody was still exploiting the crap out of them at that time. So the Indian lands were just without any protection at all. All right. So they get some protection in 1934. Now there was always a shortage of capital in Indian country, still is, and so in the IRA, Collier established some regulations, or established some programs. He wanted some programs that would establish grants for Indian tribal corporations. This is in 1934. So he's saying that in the Depression, middle of the Depression, he said, well, let's give the Indian tribal governments some money where they can start their own businesses. That went over real well in Congress. So he didn't get that one. He said, sorry, that was never funded. They did, however, increase the funding for educational, for schools, and in particular, not boarding schools, but for day schools. In other words, the federal government said, we're going to take some money that, out of the federal pot, and we're going to direct some of that money to funding rural schools in areas where there are a lot of American Indian children. Why would that be necessary? and we can stop after that one because we're almost out of time. But why would, and we'll come back to Collier next time, why would that be necessary? Why would the federal government need to be spending money on public schools in rural areas where there are a lot of Native Americans?
No state jurisdiction.
No state jurisdiction, or there may not be very much state jurisdiction within those areas. Why?
Well, what we already learned about.
Because of all the Indian land, right? And so in other words, it's not so much state jurisdiction, there's no tax base.
Well, you also couldn't make a school district where there was none, since that's a state function, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, the state, exactly. The state doesn't have any incentive to do it because number one, those people don't vote, and they're not paying a lot of taxes. So there's no local incentive for people to, to get state funding for schools. So that was the problem. Not only was it non-tax, but it was neglected by the states. The states, well, those are Indians. They're not paying state taxes. They're not subject to our laws necessarily. We can't enforce things. So this is a way for the federal government to try to reach out and kind of replace what the states everywhere else have pretty much done. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, well, that's good enough. Let's stop there, and we'll come back to talking a little bit more about the Indian Reorganization Act next time. Very important stuff. Be sure to read that stuff that I've posted for you. It's not real exciting reading, but it's pretty clear-cut stuff. All right, have a good one. See you Thursday.